Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, which is part of our ongoing Learn at Lunch series. Today's speaker is Dr. Shannon Farrell, a faculty member here at OSU's Agricultural Economics Department. He will discuss items for landowners to consider when thinking about different types of non-agricultural uses of their land. More information on this and other farm management topics may be found on the Farm Management website. I will paste the link into the chat box in the lower right corner. Please ask questions by typing them into the chat box, and Dr. Farrell will answer them at the end of the webinar. Dr. Farrell, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, good day everybody. Thank you all for joining us. And I feel like out of a sense of public health and safety, I need to warn you that I've got the flu, so you might want to wrap a surgical mask around your speakers or Lysol your computer after we're done or something like that. I just want to make sure you don't get a virus, either computer or otherwise, from the webinar. But other than that, we should be okay here. Today we're going to talk about some of the things to consider if you're approached as an agricultural landowner for things that might be non-agricultural uses of your property. And in Oklahoma, what that's kind of come to being is when we're talking about oil and gas development of the property, but in more recent years, we've also seen that take place in the context of wind energy development, and in even more recent times, in the past 3 or 4 years, we've started to see increasing interest in solar energy leasing as well. So we're going to talk about a couple of elements of the oil and gas side, kind of the traditional energy development, and then on the newer side of things, we're going to talk about issues to look at when you're evaluating a wind or a solar lease. Now, for lots of us in Oklahoma, we own or have a lease interest in just the surface interest of the property. And in Oklahoma, as in almost every other state, we recognize that we can separate the mineral interest out from the surface interest. And so as a result, over time, lots of surface property has been disconnected, if you would, from the mineral estate, which means we may not be getting a royalty check or an oil and gas lease if we're the surface owner, but we still have to deal with the surface impacts of oil and gas development. Now in Oklahoma, we have the Oklahoma Surface Damages Act that kind of provides a bill of rights, for lack of a better word, for those surface owners. So that's one of the first things I want you guys to understand, is that we do have a Surface Damage Act in Oklahoma, and that spells out the procedure for how we're supposed to go about negotiating with surface owners for the development of minerals underneath the surface. And what the Surface Damage Act is going to tell you is that we do things up front in Oklahoma. We require oil and gas developers to approach the surface owner to provide notice that they're about to begin drilling operations on the property and to negotiate in advance for what those damages will be. Now you might be thinking to yourself, that seems kind of tough. Wouldn't it be easier for us to drill the well than actually ascertain what the damages were and then make the payment? But this was part of a compromise that was reached to pass the Surface Damage Act to make sure that the surface owner had the money up front for the estimated damages that would be incurred on the property before the drilling took place. That was kind of regarded as a way of helping everyone better balance the interests that were involved here. So what will happen is that the oil and gas developers are required to make an offer for what they believe the estimated surface damages will be, render that payment, or rather make the offer of that payment to the landowner. Now the landowner can accept that. If they do, they'll take the payment, they'll enter into a surface use agreement that spells out what's going to be done, the kind of controls that the oil and gas operator is going to take to make sure the damage doesn't spread, to mitigate the damages, to restore the property after drilling, and so on. If they accept that, they sign the agreement, drilling commences. If they don't, then what will happen is that in order to drill on the property, the operator is going to have to file a lawsuit, basically, with the district court for the county in which the land is located. And the first thing that's going to happen as a result of that lawsuit is that the oil and gas operator is going to request the appointment of appraisers by the court. The appraisers work in much the same fashion as they would with almost any other condemnation case. The procedure that we use for the Surface Damage Act is actually derived from the procedure that you use if you're condemning land. And what happens in the oil and gas context is that the oil and gas operator is going to choose one appraiser, the surface owner gets to choose an appraiser, those two appraisers then get together and appoint a third appraiser. The appraisers will evaluate the property, look at the plans for the oil and gas wells development, and then come up with an estimate of what they think the cost to the surface owner would be of the development. And the way that they determine that is basically the difference in the fair market value of that property before the development takes place versus the fair market value of the property after the development takes place. The difference between those two is supposed to be the estimate of the surface damages. If the landowner accepts that amount, then a surface use agreement is signed and drilling commences. If they still don't, then the case goes to a jury trial, and the issue before the jury is what was the proper amount of damages. Now, it gets to be a little tricky at this point because you have to do some risk calculation. If you go to jury trial and the landowner gets less of an award from the jury than they were offered by the oil and gas company, they've lost the case, but also they have to pay all of the attorney's fees for the oil and gas company, so that can get pretty expensive. By the same token, though, if the jury awards them more than the oil and gas company offered, then the oil and gas company has to pay all of the landowner's attorney costs and fees. So it's a little bit of a risk calculation that you have to undertake if you decide that you don't want to undergo that. But all of that is to say, understand that you have rights as a surface owner. Those rights are protected by the Surface Damage Act. And the Surface Damage Act says that the oil and gas company has to make you an offer of the surface damages before they enter the property to drill. Now, it's important for you to think about what you're supposed to be considering in the Surface Damage Act. And we have a few cases that say when you're trying to calculate the amount of surface damages, we want you to be as comprehensive as possible in taking into account all of the impacts to the surface owner's use of the land and its value. So that can include things like the natural loss of land that's now going to be underneath the well pad, but also things like erosion damage, loss of access to certain parts of the property, or changes in cultivation practices that would have to be made. Basically anything that impacts the use of the land after the drilling will take place. So it behooves us as landowners to make sure that we have a means of backing up our assertions as to what any of those values are before we get involved with the surface damage negotiations. If you're a surface owner, it's a good idea, if you can, to have some sort of relationship and communication with the people that own your minerals, because that way you can get a heads up as to when development may be taking place, and you can kind of work together to make sure that you balance your interests. Now, I understand that in some cases that's a lot easier said than done, excuse me, because our minerals might be owned by one person. For example, if we just bought the property from someone and they retain the minerals for themselves, okay, there's one owner there. But there are lots of cases where the mineral owners may be dozens of people because the land has been passed through generations, and each generation further splits the minerals by giving their minerals in equal shares to their kids, and so on and so on and so on. So I understand it's not always possible to have a relationship with your mineral owners, but to the extent that you can, keep those lines of communication open so you can kind of know what's on the horizon with respect to those. Another thing that kind of catches some landowners by surprise is the fact that you don't have to take the surface use agreement that you're offered by the oil and gas company. I mean, the oil and gas company probably has a pretty good cadre of lawyers working for them, and that's the thing to remember, is their lawyers work for them, as lawyers should. They work for the people that are paying their bills. So you can have your lawyer draft a surface use agreement as well. Now, that's not a guarantee that the oil and gas company is going to accept it, but if it's reasonable, if it has commercially, viable provisions in it, and you're trying to make sure that you look out for your landowner's interests, some of those provisions might be adapted into the surface use agreement. Especially if you're a larger landowner and you've got a little bit more negotiating power, you might have a better shot at getting some of those factors included into the agreement, or having them use your surface use agreement as well. But just know that you don't have to take the agreement that's handed to you. You can develop your own if you want to. You should also consider maybe drafting provisions or drafting an entire agreement for exploration. Now, that's something that's often overlooked in Oklahoma, and that's the fact that the Oklahoma Surface Damage Act just covers the development of a well, okay, the drilling, production of oil and gas. It doesn't cover exploration. Exploration is usually accomplished by seismic exploration of the property, and in other words, we tend to give the earth a sonogram to see if there's oil or natural gas pockets down there. And so surface exploration through seismic means, and other means as well, by the way, that's not covered by the Surface Damage Act. There is the Oklahoma Seismic Exploration Regulation Act, which is a mouthful to say, and it says that the there are provisions in there that are basically like the Surface Damage Agreement, or sorry, the Surface Damage Act, that say there needs to be advance notice that exploration is going to take place on the property. There needs to be an offer of some sort of fee for the exploration, but that's kind of it. Things are largely left to the surface owner to handle that. And so if you have certain concerns about how seismic exploration might affect your use of the surface, well, you should have an agreement that you're prepared to offer to them to say, hey, if you want to come explore, okay, here are the provisions that we've got. Again, you don't have to take the provisions they offer. You can propose your own. That might include things like, I really would prefer that you guys don't have seismic exploration right after a rainfall, because that'll cause a lot of difficult to repair damage to pastures or croplands. And I know that that doesn't seem to be a concern in Oklahoma right now, given that we're all in drought once again, but it might rain again someday, and that's something to consider. Another thing you might want to consider is limitations on what we call shot hole explorations. Sometimes thumper trucks are used to create the vibrations that the geophysicists use to determine whether or not there might be oil and gas formations on the land, but sometimes they use explosives to create those vibrations, and you might not want those to occur within certain distances of water wells or established structures or things like that. Those are all things that you can spell out in the Surface Exploration Agreement if you want to. When we're talking about the potential damage to property, lots of us are really good at coming up with the after picture of what the property looked like after the damage had taken place. But few of us have the foresight to say, you know what, we need to take pictures of what happened to this property before there was development. So I mean that literally. Take some before pictures, document with a camera, and timestamp your photographs what things look like before exploration and development took place. But beyond the literal before pictures, also make sure your farm records are in very good shape so that you can document the productivity of the land. You might want to take some water and soil samples just to kind of document the environmental baseline of the property, and that'll help you out if down the road sometime you actually do have to document that there was damage to the property. We just talked about the importance of good farm records, things like soil analyses, water quality tests, but also your production records. The production records will help you show, for example, if there was diminished productivity in the land in terms of yields or returns, just generally, you can back that up with good farm records if you have them, but if you don't, that's kind of hard to do. Many times we talk about the actual amount of the damages and what's the dollar figure going to be, but we often don't think about restoring this land back to the way that it was supposed to be. Especially with today's horizontal drilling technologies and hydraulic fracturing, well pads are somewhat less numerous because we can reach more formations from one well pad, and that's a good thing, but those well pads, as a consequence, do tend to have to be bigger because they have to support more equipment and material being on place while we're developing the well. So think about provisions that might say, okay, once the well has been formed and properly finished out, can we reduce the size of the well pad so that it's not taking up as much space? Can we make sure that we reestablish vegetation? And that's another common issue. We hear lots of people talk about reseeding, but in a drought, reseeding, I think, means bird feeding, because you actually have to establish a fertile seed bed, water it, fertilize it, and make sure the vegetation actually gets reestablished. Think about ways that you can get paid that aren't money. And this is just a function of psychology. If you have to put a dollar sign on something, that hurts. But lots of times oil and gas companies may be willing to give you a lot more value if they don't have to think about dollar signs. And people don't do a good job of thinking about dollar signs when we're talking about in-kind things like grader services or bulldozer services or gravel or pipe or things like that. You might be able to get more material or earth-moving work than you would have gotten in terms of an actual check if you just ask for those kinds of things. And number 10, think about stuff that you can sell to the company. Water may be something of value that you have. If you have gravel or sand deposits on your property, that might be more cost-effective for them than having to truck that in from somewhere else. So think about the things that you could sell the company as well. So those are the 10 things we want you to consider when you're looking at a surface use agreement. Let's talk about the oil and gas lease. Let's say you actually have the minerals that underlie the property. What should you be looking at when you're talking about your lease? Number one, and I know this is tough, but get a feel for your bargaining position. Do you own all the minerals underlying the property that they're talking about? or are you sharing those in fractional interest with others? So the first thing you really need to do, and if you need to get in mineral abstract, do that, but really understand what is the totality of the mineral interest that you have with respect to the property that's going to be leased. And if you have the ability and the means to communicate with your other mineral owners, get together. Try to negotiate with one voice and increase your bargaining power that way. Another thing to think about with your bargaining power is how close you are to another producing well. You know, all of the things being equal, the closer you are to an already existing producing well, the more odds that you have of a producing well as well, and they know that. So make sure that you kind of have a feel for what the capacity for production of your area is going to be. If you have the surface interest and the minerals, so you own the whole shooting match from top to bottom, think holistically about that. And don't get hung up too much on the mineral lease, don't get hung up too much on the surface lease, but consider those two actions together. How do we optimize the return that we're going to get from this lease, both from the surface and from the minerals? And remember, too, that if you own the minerals, you have ultimate power over what that surface use agreement is supposed to look like, because they're not going to drill without you signing off if you own the minerals and the surface as well. Understand how long your lease is going to last, and the answer is it's going to be for a really long time if your well produces, because in virtually every oil and gas lease in Oklahoma, the lease is designed to last for so long as oil and gas are produced in paying quantities from the well. And what the courts have taken that language to mean is you can hold the lease of those minerals as long as that well is producing enough oil and gas to cover its very basic costs of operation. Excuse me. So as long as it's producing enough oil and gas to cover the electric bill for the pump, or the fuel bill for the pump, or whatever the case might be, that lease can be held. But you also need to understand that if your well has been pooled or unitized, in other words, it's being designated as the well that's producing an area of land around where the lease is, production from other lands, as long as they're part of that pool or unit, can also hold your lease. So make sure you read the lease very closely to see how production from other land might actually hold your land under the lease as well. Know how to read a lease and know how to modify it. Again, just the same thing that we talked about. You don't have to accept the lease that they give you. You can have your attorney prepare a lease or a lease rider or maybe a lease appendix that includes the terms that you think are important, things that deal with perhaps deductions for production costs. Can the well... Sorry, let me back up. When we talk about production costs, we mean, for example, can desulfurization of the oil or gas, anything that's used to make the oil and gas more marketable or higher value, those are costs that might be deducted from your royalty check unless the lease specifically provides otherwise. We've kind of already talked about point number 5 when we were discussing point number 3, but just remember that production from other land can actually hold your lease as well, so make sure you read the pooling and unitization provisions on your lease to deal with that. Understand how you get paid, where you get paid, and when you get paid. Sometimes, for example, your lease may not be the most productive thing in the world. A friend of mine and I own a property in Stillwater together, and it's part of a unit that produces oil and gas here in the city. Our annual royalty checks come out to be about $20. And that's only because we negotiated in our lease that they would have to pay us when our royalties accumulated to $20, because they wanted to pay us only when the royalties accumulated to $100, and that would be every 5 years. And we thought, no, we want to check every year, by gosh. So understand what the accumulated royalties have to be before you get paid. Some of you may have leases that are a little bit more productive than the lease that me and my friend have. You might be getting thousands of dollars a year. And so you might be getting annual checks, or you might be getting quarterly checks. And in some extreme cases, you might be getting monthly checks as well. But understand what that frequency will be, understand what those accumulations are, understand whether or not those payments are going to be made by direct deposit to you or if they'll be made by check, and understand what your remedies are if you don't get paid. What's the amount of time that you have to provide them written notice? Lots of leases will say that you have to give the oil and gas developer written notice if you don't get paid for the clock to start running on what remedies you can offer if you're not getting paid. So make sure you read and understand all those provisions, understand the when, where, and how of your payments. Understand what can be deducted. We alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there are lots of expenses the oil and gas company might be able to legally withhold from your check before they calculate how much to pay for your royalty. So read that very carefully, understand what those expenses are, and if you have any expenses that can be deducted, I would insist that when I got paid, I receive some sort of statement that set out what those expenses were so I could document whether or not my payment had been calculated correctly. Make sure, by the way, you reserve the right to audit those payments. That's just what we talked about. Make sure that you have the ability to examine their records and make sure that your payments have been calculated correctly, because there have been lots of Oklahoma lawsuits that talk about what happens when you don't have those payments made correctly. The next point, number 9, flashes back to something that's kind of been out of practice for a long time, but it's still out there, so I want to make people aware of it. And that is that in the old days, lots of people would put their social security numbers on their leases as a means of verifying their identity and also making sure that the oil and gas company had the information on there to fill out the W-2s or the 1099 MISC forms to make sure that withholding was being calculated correctly. But do not put your social security number on an oil and gas lease, and that's because the oil and gas lease is going to be recorded in the county land records, and now your social security number is out there for the public to see. In today's era of identity theft, that is an absolute no-no. So make sure that you do not put your social security number on a lease, and if you want to get really paranoid about it, don't mail your social security number to the oil and gas company in the same mailing that contains your executed lease. Send that under separate cover to make sure there's no chance of that accidentally getting filed along with the lease in the county land records. And lastly, before we move on to our next topic, you're going to get lots of pressure to sign this oil and gas lease or the surface damage agreement or this wind lease or solar lease really fast, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime offer. You need to sign right now. That's to try to make you sign something that's exactly what they want it to read, that doesn't contain anything that you want in there. So take your time, have it reviewed by a legal professional, but don't waste too much time, because time's money for you and them as well. But if anybody wants you to sign a lease and they will not give you the time to have it reviewed by a legal professional, push it back across the table and say no thank you. If they don't want that reviewed by a lawyer, that should be a huge red flag for you. Okay, we got about 10 minutes left in our webinar, and I've got 10 things that I want to talk to you about in terms of wind and solar energy leases. Now, this is a lot different from the oil and gas lease. There are some similarities, but wind and solar are electrical leases. The electrical utility industry works a lot differently from the oil and gas industry. There are different margins involved. There are different royalty calculations. Everything's just a little different. And even in between wind and solar leases, there are some differences as well. So we're going to talk to you about those, and where there are differences, we'll try to point those out to you. The first thing I want you to think about when you're approached for a wind or solar lease is, how is this going to affect my use of the surface? And the answer is a lot different between wind and solar projects. Wind projects might seem to take up a lot of space. For example, the strings of turbines might go on for miles. And in terms of overall leased acreage, yeah, wind energy projects lease a lot of acres, but they actually occupy a very small amount of that. Research we did here at OSU showed that for about every megawatt of wind capacity that a project has, it probably physically occupies about 0.87 acres, less than an acre for every megawatt of capacity, and that's including the turbine pads, the roads, the substations, all of that stuff taken together. So they may be really spread out, but wind energy projects actually occupy very little real estate. Now, on the flip side of that, solar projects are much smaller in terms of the leased acres. Lots of Oklahoma's projects are between 5-10 acres. Some of the bigger projects are closer to 20 acres. But they occupy a much greater proportion of that acreage than a wind project does. Wind projects, often occupy about 1%, like 1% of the total leased acreage. Solar projects occupy closer to 40 or 50% of the acreage that's leased. So the land use in solar is a much more intensive use with a smaller overall acreage leased. Wind energy projects much more expansive, but occupy a much smaller proportion of the acreage that's leased. With wind, Usually the leases are very explicit in allowing cropping operations, grazing operations, things of that sort to occur on the leased land. Solar projects often will prohibit any agricultural use of the property. There is one little exception to that. Certain types of solar projects will allow the use of goats or sheep to graze around the panels, because that's about the only animal that will fit underneath them without bumping the equipment. So if you have sheep or goats, you might ask, well, can I graze them in the area of the solar project and not cause any problems? With wind or solar leases, they might be fairly long. Most of the wind leases that we've seen in Oklahoma last for about 50 years. They might last for an initial term of about 30 years with some 10-year renewal periods after that, or variations around that theme. Solar leases, the one or two solar leases that we've got to see in the state, have lasted for 20 to 30 years. And the reason these leases are so long is because there's a lot of fixed cost involved in the project. So the company is saying, we want to extract as much of that fixed cost as we can out of the project, and a longer lease allows us to do that. So just understand, those leases are going to take that land and hold it for that kind of use for a fairly long period of time, and you need to make sure that you're comfortable with that. You need to understand how lease renewals are made part of that lease. Like I said earlier, you might look at a lease and say, oh, it's got a 30-year term, and think, well, this lease is going to be 30 years. But if you read further, you see, and the developer has the option of, for example, 2 10-year renewals. Well, then it's not a 30-year lease. You have to think of it as a 50-year lease. Always make sure you take into account those renewals, because functionally, if they're developer-only options, that's going to extend the term of your lease, and you really won't have an opportunity to say much about that. If your lease might cause any change in the taxes for your property or your insurance premiums, consider that too, and make sure you have provisions that will compensate you if there is an increase in your premium or an increase in your property taxes. And in all of our research that we've done in Oklahoma, we haven't seen, for example, any wind energy projects where the assessor increased the value of the underlying land in response to the project. We have actually, and I mean this very literally, pulled the ad valorem tax records for every single wind turbine in the state, and all of the assessors have regarded those turbines as being personal property and taxed those to the developer, not to the landowner. And to the extent that we've talked to all those assessors, none of those assessors have taken the cash flows and capitalized them into the land cost to increase the assessed value. Now that may change in time, but at least as of our research right now, that hasn't been the case. But it's important to have a provision in there that says, if that does change, we'll have some sort of compensation so it's not costing us more to own the property just because the solar or wind project is there. Excuse me. When you're calculating your royalty payments, understand how those payments are going to be made. And especially for wind projects, there might be multiple layers of royalty payments. You might, for example, get a capacity-based minimum royalty. That minimum royalty might say, for example, the developer will pay you $5,000 per year per turbine located on your property as a minimum. And then we'll calculate the royalty amount, and if the royalty amount is greater than the minimum, we'll pay you the difference at the end of the year. Solar projects tend to be based more just on capacity. I've not yet seen any Oklahoma solar leases that were a royalty basis, but that's not to say that those leases are not out there. They very well might take that form in the not so distant future. But what I want you to do whenever you're presented with a lease is very clearly understand the basis on which your payments are going to be calculated, and like we talked about earlier, make sure you have some means of verifying the accuracy of those payment calculations. If you're paid on a royalty basis, the royalty is not necessarily a royalty in the same way that an oil and gas lease is, but most often it's going to be defined by some percentage of the gross revenue generated from the sale of power that was generated on your property. Wind leases almost universally start out at a 4% royalty. In other words, you would get 4% of the gross revenues from power generated on your property. You also need a means of understanding how much power was generated from your property, and that can vary from lease to lease as well. We haven't seen enough solar leases in Oklahoma to get a good feel for what that market number is. It tends to be a little bit lower, though, in the leases that we've seen, and that's because solar power is a little more expensive to generate in terms of the equipment than wind power. Those numbers, I think, are going to come down over time. They may equal, and solar might even drop to be a little bit below what wind is, but for right now, the royalty numbers that we have seen where that is a royalty, and again, with most solar operations, it's not a royalty, it's just a fixed per capacity payment. So in other words, if we're going to install 5 megawatts of capacity on your land, we're going to pay this fixed amount. In other solar leases I've seen, by the way, it's just a flat annual payment. It's not based on capacity, it's basically just a lease of the land where the solar panels are located. So understand how that payment is going to work. Make sure you can verify that. Make sure you can audit those payments. Know what triggers your payments. For example, you might have a payment that is due upon starting construction of the starting construction of the project, in which case you should need to know, what does that mean? Does that mean when you flag the layout? Does that mean when you start moving dirt with a grader? Does that mean the first time the equipment shows up on your property? But you need to understand what those milestones are. Same thing as commercial operation or commercial generation. You might hear it called COD, the commercial operation date. But understand what that definition is. When we say commercial operation date, does that mean the first day that that project is generating power and putting it to the grid? Because that's something that triggers a different set of payments. Know what those milestones are, and also know how you're going to verify that. It's really hard to look at a solar project and tell when it's generating power. It really doesn't move a lot. So you actually have to have some sort of notification that tells you, hey, we're now generating commercial power. Be very clear on how your land is going to be released from any sorts of encumbrances that are caused by the project. Your project probably comes with some liens, maybe some easements, any sort of thing that might be connected to the title of the land, and make sure you understand how that's going to be released when the project is over. So, for example, you probably want to have a provision in your lease that says, developer, you're not allowed to do anything that will create a lien on this property. And if by chance you do, you need to have some sort of escrow fund or security that makes sure I'll have the ability to release that lien if it's ever put in place on my property to make sure my title remains clean. If you have any easements and you stop using the project, you will go forward into the county records office and release those liens so those don't encumber my title any further after the project's been completed. Make sure you have a means of getting rid of any sort of encumbrance on your property that might be caused by the project after the project's been completed. And then again, always make sure that you have the means to harmonize how you use the surface for agriculture with the development of the property for energy. Most wind leases will include a provision that say the surface owner can still use the land for livestock production, crops, etc., etc. But if your lease doesn't have that, make sure you get that put in there. As again with solar is a lot more intensive use of the property over a smaller area, so you may not have the ability to graze or raise crops in the area, but negotiate, see if you can get that in place. Just make sure that you can reserve the right to use the surface as you've been using it in a way that's consistent with the project. And in 32 minutes, I apologize guys, we almost made it. That's kind of the quick overview of energy development on agricultural lands. Don't forget to take our survey regarding the webinar there. Brent's got that link for you up on the screen right now. But while you guys are taking a look at that, if anybody does have any questions, go ahead and throw those into the chat box and we'll try to answer some of those while we're waiting.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. I think you nailed it on timing, so no worries there. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We do appreciate you telling us how we're doing by filling out our survey. We are working on future webinars, but we have not yet determined the dates or formally scheduled them yet. We will let everyone know, though, when we do schedule our next webinars through email and Facebook. So if there are any questions, we'll wrap it up. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy your afternoon. Bye.